Charlotte Reed stepped over the raw dirt of a grave that wasn't even a day old and walked straight toward the one corral in Wyoming territory that every soul in town had sworn off for good. Behind her, mourners still stood black-clad and weeping over Tom Riley's fresh headstone, and not one of them believed she'd last 5 minutes with the horse that put him there. She didn't slow down to prove them wrong. She just climbed the fence. If you've ever been told you were too much trouble for a job, everyone else was scared to finish. Stay with me to the end, and drop the name of the city you're watching from below, because I love seeing how far this story has traveled. And if this is your first time riding along, hit that subscribe button, because this one's only getting started. Nobody in Larkspur Hollow had ever seen a burial go quite so fast. Reverend Aldous Pike hadn't even finished the last line of scripture before half the mourners were already turning for their wagons, hats pressed to their chests, eyes cutting sideways toward the coal ranch a half-mile off. They weren't in a hurry because they didn't care about Tom Riley. They were in a hurry because word had already spread through Larkspur Hollow that some fool woman had ridden in on the noon stage asking after the horse that killed a man, and folks wanted to see for themselves whether she was serious or just simple. Charlotte heard the whispers before she ever saw a single face turn toward her. "That's her," a woman muttered, not troubling herself to lower her voice. "The one asking about Cole's stallion?" "Lord have mercy," said another. As if one funeral this week wasn't enough, Charlotte kept her spine straight and her boots moving. She'd buried a husband once. She knew exactly what mourning looked like, and she knew exactly what it felt like to have people whisper about you like you weren't standing 3 feet away with ears that worked just fine. She didn't flinch from it anymore. She'd used up all her flinching 2 years back in a graveyard that looked a whole lot like this one, in a town that looked a whole lot like this one, standing over a coffin that held a man who'd promised her forever and given her 4 years instead. She found Nathaniel Cole standing apart from the others, hat in his hands, staring at the fresh grave like it might rearrange itself back into a living man if he looked hard enough. "Mr. Cole?" she said. He didn't turn right away. When he finally did, his eyes were red-rimmed but dry, the kind of dry that came from a man who'd already cried everything out of himself years before and had nothing left to spend on a hired hand's grave, no matter how guilty he felt standing over it. "You're the one who wired ahead," he said. "Not a question. Charlotte Reed." She put her hand out. He looked at it like he wasn't sure what to do with a woman's handshake, then took it anyway, quick and businesslike. "I heard you lost a man to that stallion." "Heard fast?" he said. "I make it my business to hear fast. It's how I find work." Something in his jaw tightened. "This ain't the day for it, Miss Reed. With respect, Mr. Cole, I don't believe there's ever going to be a good day for it. That's rather the point of a horse like that." A muscle jumped near his eye. Behind him she could already see the ranch hands gathering at a distance, arms crossed, waiting to see how their boss handled the woman who'd shown up asking to work with the animal that had just orphaned 2 children of a man they'd all called friend. "You know what happened to Tom?" Cole asked. "I heard the horse threw him into the fence rail, heard his neck broke before he hit the ground." "That's the polite version," Cole said, voice flat and low. "Polite version leaves out that I was standing right there. Leaves out that I watched a good man die in about 4 seconds, and there wasn't one thing I could do to stop it." He put his hat back on like the conversation was finished before it started. "So no, ma'am. I don't need a trainer today. I need to bury a friend and figure out how in the hell I explain to his widow why her husband ain't coming home." He turned to walk away. Charlotte let him get 3 steps before she spoke again. "I'm not asking you for sympathy, Mr. Cole, and I'm not asking for a warm welcome. I'm asking for a corral and a week. You can watch from the fence the whole time with a rifle in your hands if it eases your mind any." That stopped him. He turned back slow. And this time when he looked at her, really looked, she watched him take in the plain gray dress, dusty from 3 days of stage travel, the leather satchel worn soft at the corners, the calluses on her hands that no proper lady in Larkspur Hollow would ever have let show. She'd learned to read that look a long time ago. It was the look men gave her right before they decided she was either lying about what she could do or too pitiful to bother turning away. "You ever actually worked a horse like Cain?" he asked. "I've worked plenty of horses men called unworkable." "That ain't what I asked." "No," she admitted. "I've never worked a horse that killed a man, but I have worked a horse that killed the only life I had left, so I'd wager I understand him better than you think." The words came out before she'd meant to let them sharper and more honest than she usually allowed herself to be with a stranger. Cole's eyes narrowed, not unkindly, just curious in the way of a man who'd heard a crack in someone's voice, and couldn't quite place where it had come from. "That a fact?" he said quietly. "It's a fact I don't discuss for free, Mr. Cole, so you'll forgive me if I leave it there." Before he could answer, a voice cut across the yard, rough as gravel and twice as unwelcoming. "Boss, you ain't seriously entertaining this." Charlotte turned to find a broad-shouldered man striding toward them, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a face weathered into a permanent scowl by 30-some years of Wyoming sun. He stopped a few feet off and looked her up and down, like she was a horse he was deciding whether to buy. "Otis," Cole said a warning in the single word. "We just put Tom into the ground," Otis Pruitt said, ignoring him entirely, eyes fixed on Charlotte. "And you're standing here fixing to let some woman waltz into that corral like she's got something the rest of us don't." "Maybe I do," Charlotte said. Otis let out a short, humorless laugh. "Lady, I've broke horses since before you were in pigtails. Tom broke horses. Every man on this ranch has broke horses, and that animal in there put 3 of us in the doctor's care and 1 of us in the ground. You're going to stand there in your travel dress and tell me you'll succeed where we all failed." "I'm going to stand here and tell you I intend to try," Charlotte said, "which is more than I can say for anyone else in this yard right now, seeing as how you're all still standing outside that fence." A few of the other hands made a sound that might have been a laugh quickly swallowed. Otis's face went red. "You think this is funny?" he said. "A man is dead." "I think it's tragic," Charlotte said, and her voice dropped, losing its edge, turning quiet and certain in a way that made even Otis pause. "I think it's tragic that Horse is going to keep hurting people until somebody figures out why he's hurting them in the first place. And I think it's tragic that everyone standing in this yard has already decided the answer is a bullet, because a bullet is easier than patience." Nobody spoke for a moment. Somewhere behind the barn, low and rolling like distant thunder, came a sound Charlotte recognized instantly, the heavy, furious strike of hooves against wood, a stallion pacing a fence line he hated with everything in him. Cole's eyes flicked toward the sound, then back to her. "You hear that?" he said. "That's been going on since sunup, since before we even lowered Tom into the ground. That horse has been tearing that corral apart for 3 days straight, and not one man here can get within 20 feet of the fence without him coming at it like the devil himself." "I'd like to see him," Charlotte said. "That's a bad idea, ma'am," said a younger hand near the back, barely more than a boy, his voice cracking on the word ma'am, like he wasn't sure a grown woman ought to be called that when she was about to do something so foolish. "I didn't ask whether it was a good idea," Charlotte said. "I asked to see him." Cole studied her another long moment. Then without a word he turned and started walking toward the sound of splintering wood, and after a beat of hesitation, Charlotte followed, feeling every eye in that ranch yard fix itself to her back like a brand. The corral came into view past the barn, and even from 30 feet off, Charlotte felt something tighten low in her stomach. The stallion was black from nose to tail, no white on him anywhere, like he'd been cut whole out of a moonless night. He was pacing the fence line in short, violent bursts, head-low ears pinned flat. Muscles coiled tight enough to snap. Every few strides he'd slam a shoulder into the rail just to feel the wood shudder, then wheel and do it again on the opposite side, like he was trying to break out of his own skin, and the fence was simply what stood in the way. "They call him Cain," Cole said low, standing well back from the rail himself. "Wasn't my choosing. Tom named him that the week we got him on account of the mark on his hip." He nodded toward the horse's left flank, where a jagged white scar cut through the black coat in a shape that did, if you squinted, resemble something like a brand of judgment. Said any horse marked like that was cursed before he even drew breath. "Where'd you get him?" Bought him off a drover passing through cheap on account of nobody else wanted him. Should have known then. Cole's jaw worked. The drover said he'd killed a man back in Nebraska. I didn't believe him. Figured it was just talk to justify the low price. He looked at the horse now tearing another furious lap around the enclosure. Guess I owe that drover an apology I'll never get to give. Charlotte didn't answer right away. She was watching the stallion, really watching him the way she'd learned to watch a horse before she ever tried to touch one. Not at the muscle, not at the teeth bared every time he passed near a human shape, but at the eyes. And what she saw there wasn't rage. It was terror. "He's not angry," she said quietly. Otis, who had trailed after them despite himself, gave a short bark of disbelief. "Lady, that horse just killed a man 3 days ago. If that ain't angry, I don't know what is." "Fear looks like anger from a distance," Charlotte said, not taking her eyes off the horse. "Especially in something that big. A creature that size doesn't get to be afraid quietly. When he's scared, the whole world has to know it because the whole world is what he thinks is coming for him. And you know that how?" Otis demanded. Charlotte finally turned to look at him. "Because I've felt exactly like that, Mr. Pruitt. Not on 4 legs, but I know what it is to be so scared of getting hurt again that you'd rather tear the world apart than let anyone close enough to try." That quieted him, at least for a moment. Cole, standing between them, said nothing, but Charlotte caught him studying her again, longer this time, like he was recalculating something. "You said he threw Tom into the rail," Charlotte said. "What was Tom doing right before?" Cole hesitated, trying to rope him. Standard gentling. Get a line on him, let him fight it out on the rope till he tires, then work him down from there. And before that, what set him off? Nothing. He'd been calm enough that morning. Tom went in slow-talking soft, same as he always did. Horse let him get maybe 10 feet before he bolted. 10 feet, Charlotte repeated. Not 5, not 2. 10 feet, and something inside him decided that was too close. What's your point, Miss Reed? My point is, that's not a mad dog snapping at anything that moves. That's a very specific line somebody drew, and every man in this yard has been stepping over it without knowing it's there. That's not incurable. That's information. She glanced at him. Somebody hurt this horse bad, Mr. Cole. Not here. Before you had him. And nobody's ever bothered finding out how, because it's easier to just call him cursed and be done with it. For a long moment, Cole said nothing. The stallion behind them slammed into the fence again, hard enough to rattle the top rail loose from its post, and somewhere behind them, a small voice gasped. Charlotte turned to find a little girl, no older than 8, standing half-hidden behind a hay wagon, dark curls escaping a braid, eyes wide and wet, fixed not on the horse, but on her father. "Ruth," Cole said, and something in his voice cracked open just slightly, just enough for Charlotte to see the man underneath the rancher. "I told you to stay at the house." "I wanted to see," the girl said, small and defiant. "I wanted to see if the horse was going to hurt somebody else." Cole crossed the distance in 3 long strides and crouched in front of her, hands on her shoulders. "Nobody's getting hurt today, you hear me? You go on back to Martha. This ain't a place for you." "Is she going to go in there?" Ruth asked, peering around her father's shoulder at Charlotte. "With Cain. That's not your worry." "Tom went in there," Ruth said, voice trembling now, "and Tom didn't come home." Charlotte watched Cole's face crumble for exactly 1 second before he forced it back into place, and something in her chest ached with a familiarity she hadn't expected to feel this soon, this fast, in a stranger's ranch yard, on a stranger's worst day. She knew that particular kind of fear. The fear of a child who had already learned far too young that people you loved could walk into a place and simply not walk back out. She crouched down slowly, keeping her distance, meeting the girl at her own height. "What's your name?" she asked, gentle. "Ruth." "Ruth, that's a fine name. I'm Charlotte." Ruth studied her with the unflinching suspicion only children seem able to manage. "Are you scared of him?" Charlotte considered lying. Considered saying something brave and hollow, the way adults so often did to children, the kind of comfort that didn't hold up to a single hard question. She decided against it. "A little," she admitted. Any person with sense is a little scared of something that big and that hurt. But being scared doesn't mean you can't still try to help. That's what Papa says about everything, Ruth said. And it don't always work out. The honesty of it hit Charlotte harder than she expected. She glanced up at Cole, who was watching his daughter with an expression of raw, helpless love that told her everything she needed to know about the kind of man he was. Not cruel, not careless, just a man who'd been handed more grief than one person ought to carry, and was doing his level best not to drown in it. No, Charlotte said, turning back to Ruth. It doesn't always work out. Sometimes trying still ends in losing. I know that better than most people you'll ever meet. She let that sit a moment, let it be true instead of comforting. But not trying guarantees it, and I'd rather lose having tried than lose having done nothing at all. Ruth studied her a long moment, then looked past her at the horse still pacing, still furious, still terrified. He killed Tom, the girl whispered. I know, Charlotte said. And I'm sorry for it. I truly am, but I don't think that horse woke up wanting to kill anybody, Ruth. I think somewhere a long time before he ever came here, somebody made him so afraid that fear is the only language he's got left. That's not a curse, that's a wound. And wounds, even old ones, even ugly ones, they can heal if somebody's patient enough to let them. Cole had gone very still beside them. Martha's calling you, he said quietly to his daughter, though Charlotte hadn't heard anyone call at all. Ruth looked at him, then at Charlotte, then finally trudged off toward the house, glancing back twice before she disappeared around the corner of the barn. When she was gone, Cole straightened and turned to Charlotte, and the softness that had been in his face while talking to his daughter hardened back into something guarded and tired. You shouldn't talk to her like that, he said, filling her head with notions about wounds and healing. She's already lost her mother. She don't need to go falling for the idea that everything broken fixes itself if you just wait long enough. I didn't say it fixes itself, Charlotte said. I said it can heal. Those aren't the same thing, Mr. Cole. Healing takes work. It takes somebody willing to stay close to the hurt instead of running from it or shooting it. I wasn't lying to your daughter. I don't make a habit of lying to children about grief. I know it too well to insult them with easy answers. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of respect he wasn't yet ready to admit to. You said you lost something to a horse, he said. Before. You never finished telling me. Charlotte's eyes drifted back to Cain, still pacing, still slamming his weight against the rails like he could outrun whatever memory was chasing him. My husband, she said. Daniel, he was breaking a green colt for a neighbor, doing it as a favor, nothing more. Colt spooked at a rattler in the grass and threw him into a fence post. Broke his neck instant. Didn't suffer. The doctor told me like that was supposed to be a comfort. Her voice stayed even practiced, the way it always did when she told this particular truth worn smooth by 2 years of repetition. The bank held the note on our land in his name alone. 6 weeks after the funeral, they came and took the ranch my father built with his own 2 hands, and I had nowhere left to be a widow except wherever the next stage was headed. Cole was quiet for a long moment. That why you do this, he said finally. Take on horses nobody else will. I do this because it's the only work a woman alone can find that pays enough to eat. Charlotte said, honest in a way that surprised even her. But I'd be lying if I said that was the whole of it. There's something about standing across from an animal that's hurting the way I've hurt and finding a way through to it anyway that makes the rest of it feel less like it was all for nothing. She looked at him directly. I'm not asking you to trust me, Mr. Cole. I'm asking you to let me try something none of your men have tried, because everything they have tried has ended in a grave. For a long moment, the only sound in the yard was Cain's hooves against splintering wood and the distant creak of a screen door, where Ruth had disappeared inside the house. 1 week. Cole said finally, the words dragged out of him, like they cost something. You get 1 week, Miss Reed, and you don't go in that corral without me at the fence, rifle loaded. First sign you're in real danger, I put him down myself, and I won't wait for your permission to do it. Fair enough. And if Otis or any of my men tell you to get back, you get back. I've buried 1 person off this ranch this week. I don't aim to bury a second. Understood. He studied her another moment like he was still trying to decide whether he'd just made the worst mistake of a very bad week or the only decent choice left to him. "Why do you care so much?" he asked quietly. "About a horse you never met on a ranch you'd never heard of a week ago." Charlotte looked past him at Kane, who had stopped his pacing for just a moment, chest heaving, eyes rolling white at the edges, as he stared at the two humans standing at his fence like they were the last thing keeping the sky from falling, because somebody decided he wasn't worth saving before they ever gave him the chance to prove otherwise, she said. "And I know exactly what that feels like, Mr. Cole. I've spent 2 years being the horse nobody wanted to bother gentling. So no, I'm not going to walk away from him just because it's dangerous. Dangerous has never once frightened me the way being forgotten does." That evening, after the ranch hands had drifted back to the bunkhouse muttering their doubts, Charlotte sat on an overturned feed bucket a good 20 feet from Kane's corral, close enough to be seen far enough to pose no threat, and simply watched. She didn't approach. She didn't speak. She let the stallion pace and snort and slam his great black body against the rails until slowly, over the better part of an hour, his strides began to shorten. His breathing began to even, and he finally came to stand in the far corner of the enclosure, head low, one back leg cocked in exhausted surrender, watching her with an expression she recognized bone deep. Not hatred, not madness, grief wearing the shape of violence because nobody had ever taught it another way to speak. She was still sitting there when Nathaniel Cole came to find her a lantern in one hand, his face unreadable in the gathering dark. "Otis wired ahead to town," he said. "Silas Kane's coming out tomorrow morning. Wants to discuss the note on this ranch personally, he says." His mouth twisted like the name tasted bitter. "Given what happened to Tom, I reckon he figures now's the perfect time to make his offer again while I'm too broke down to say no." "Who's Silas Kane?" Cole's jaw tightened in the lantern light. "Man who holds paper on half this valley and wants to hold paper on the other half before winter. Man who's made it real clear he'd take this land off my hands the easy way or the hard way and don't much care which." He looked toward the corral, toward the black shape of the stallion standing motionless in the dark. "And Kane here was supposed to be the answer. A stud contract with the Army post at Fort Carrington, enough money to clear the note before Kane could get his hands on this place. Now Tom's dead, the contract's like to fall through if that horse can't be gentled inside the month, and Kane's coming to collect." Charlotte absorbed that in silence, watching the stallion's ears flick toward the sound of their voices before settling again. "Then I suppose," she said slowly, "we'd best not disappoint him." Cole looked at her for a long moment. Lantern light flickering across a face caught somewhere between exhaustion and the first unfamiliar stirrings of hope he didn't quite trust himself to feel. "You really believe you can gentle that horse in a week?" he said. It wasn't quite a question anymore. "I believe?" Charlotte said, rising from the bucket, brushing the dust from her skirt, eyes never leaving the dark shape of the wounded animal in the corral, "that everyone in this valley has spent so long calling him cursed, nobody's ever once stopped to ask him what happened to make him that way. I intend to ask." She glanced at Cole, steady and certain, in a way that surprised them both. "And I intend to stay until he finally answers." Behind her in the dark, Kane let out a low, uncertain sound that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a sigh. And for the first time since she'd stepped off the noon stage into a town already burying its dead, Charlotte Reed allowed herself to hope that this time, in this corral on this ranch nobody wanted to bet on, she might finally be standing exactly where she was always meant to be. Charlotte woke before sunrise to the sound of hooves against wood. Steady, this time. Not frantic, a slower, more deliberate rhythm, as if the animal himself hadn't slept either. She dressed by lamplight in the small room Cole's housekeeper Martha had grudgingly prepared for her, pulled on her boots, and was halfway across the yard before the sky had fully lightened from black to gray. She found Cole already at the fence rifle, resting easy in the crook of his arm, dark circles beneath his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept much either. "You're up early," he said. "So are you." "Couldn't sleep, kept thinking about Kane's visit." He nodded toward the horizon, toward the road that led into town. "He'll be here by 9. Told Otis to have coffee ready. Man likes to feel welcomed, even when he ain't." Charlotte kept her eyes on Kane, who had stopped his pacing to watch her approach the fence. Ears swiveled forward, body still tense, but no longer coiled tight enough to strike. "He's watching me different this morning," she said. "Different how? Like he's deciding whether I'm worth being afraid of." She set her satchel down slow, careful not to startle him with sudden movement. "That's progress, Mr. Cole. Yesterday he wasn't deciding anything. Yesterday the answer was already made up before I ever climbed that fence." Cole studied the horse a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "Otis thinks you're fixing to get yourself killed before Kane even shows his face. Otis is entitled to think whatever helps him sleep at night." A ghost of something like amusement flickered at the corner of Cole's mouth, gone almost before it arrived. "You always talk like that, like nothing scares you." "No," Charlotte said honestly. "I talk like that because if I let people see how scared I actually am, they stop trusting me to do the job. Fear's a private thing, Mr. Cole. I don't hand it out for free any more than I hand out my reasons." She climbed the fence before he could answer, and any words he might have had died in his throat as she dropped down inside the corral alone, 20 feet from a horse that had killed a man 3 days prior. Kane's ears pinned back the instant her boots hit the dirt. Charlotte didn't move toward him. She lowered herself down exactly where she'd sat the evening before, folded her hands in her lap, and let her eyes drop not away from him entirely, but soft, unfocused the way a person looks at something they aren't hunting. "I know you don't want me here," she said quietly, voice pitched low and even. "I know every person who's ever come into this pen has wanted something from you. A rope around your neck, a saddle on your back, obedience you never agreed to give." She let a long breath out. "I don't want any of that. Not yet. Maybe not ever if you decide you can't give it." Kane snorted hard and took 2 stamping steps sideways, head tossing. "That's fine," Charlotte said. "You don't owe me calm. You don't owe me trust. You don't owe me one single thing, and I aim to prove that to you by staying right here and asking for nothing." Behind her at the fence, she heard Cole shift his weight, the small creak of leather as his grip tightened on the rifle. She didn't turn. Minutes passed. Kane paced the far end of the corral, snorting, tossing his head, testing the boundary of how close he could come without committing to anything. Each pass brought him a few feet nearer than the last. Charlotte counted them silently, 30 feet, 28, 25, and did not move, did not speak again, simply let her breathing stay slow and visible so the animal could see. Plain as anything that she posed him no threat. Then without warning, Kane wheeled and charged the fence rail nearest Cole, slamming his shoulder into it with a crack that split the morning quiet like a gunshot. Cole's rifle came up instantly. "Don't," Charlotte said sharp, not turning her head. "Don't you dare." "He's testing the rail, Miss Reed, and that rail's already cracked from 3 days of this." "He's testing you," she said, "not the wood. You raised that rifle and he heard it. Horses hear intention before they hear sound." "Mr. Cole, lower it." For a long, terrible second, nobody moved. Then slowly, Cole let the barrel drop. Kane's ears flicked, his great chest heaved. And after a moment, he backed 3 steps away from the fence and stood still, watching them both with an expression that was no longer purely rage. It was calculation. "He's smarter than anybody's given him credit for," Charlotte murmured mostly to herself. "That's supposed to comfort me. It's supposed to tell you he's not simple-minded and dangerous. He's careful and dangerous. Those are 2 very different animals, Mr. Cole, and only one of them can ever be reasoned with." By the time the sun had climbed fully over the tree line, Charlotte had made no visible progress by any measure Otis Pruitt would have recognized as progress. She hadn't touched the horse, hadn't roped him, hadn't so much as raised her voice. She'd simply sat and watched, and let hours pass while Kane paced smaller and smaller circles around her stillness. Otis found Cole at the fence around mid-morning arms, crossed mouth already twisted into its familiar scowl. "She's just sitting there," he said. "Ain't done a blessed thing all morning except sit in the dirt like a child playing house." "She's working," Cole said. "She's wasting time is what she's doing, and Kane's gonna be here in—" He checked the sun's position, a habit older than any pocket watch. "Hour, maybe less. What's he gonna think riding up and seeing that horse still tearing around the pen same as it was 3 days ago?" "He's not tearing around anymore," Cole said, nodding toward the corral where Kane now stood in relative stillness at the far rail, watching Charlotte with wary, unblinking focus. "Look at him, Otis. That's the calmest he's been since Tom died." Otis looked. His scowl didn't quite disappear, but it softened just slightly into something closer to grudging confusion. "That don't mean nothing," he muttered, though his voice had lost some of its conviction. "Horse could still snap the second she gets close enough to matter." "Could be," Cole allowed. "But he ain't tried to kill anybody in 3 hours, and that's 3 hours longer than anybody managed since Tuesday." Otis didn't answer that. He turned and walked back toward the barn, but Charlotte, catching the exchange from inside the corral, noted the small crack forming in his certainty and tucked it away like a coin worth saving. Silas Kane arrived precisely at 9, exactly as promised, riding a gelding too fine and too clean for honest ranch work, flanked by 2 men who didn't bother introducing themselves and clearly weren't meant to. Charlotte had climbed out of the corral by then, dust-streaked and weary but calm, standing beside Cole on the porch when the riders came into the yard. She felt Cole go rigid beside her the moment Kane's face came into view, a lean, silver-templed man, somewhere past 50, dressed too well for a working ranch, with the kind of smile that never once touched his eyes. "Nathaniel," Kane said, swinging down from his horse with practiced ease. "Terrible business what happened to your man. Terrible. I came the moment I heard." "You came the moment it was convenient to press your offer," Cole said flatly. "No need to dress it up as neighborly concern, Silas." Kane's smile didn't waver. "Straight to it, then. I respect a man who doesn't waste breath on pleasantries." He glanced toward Charlotte, taking her in with the same assessing look Cole had given her the day before, though colder, more calculating. "And who might this be?" "Charlotte Reed," Cole said. "She's working the stallion." Something flickered across Kane's face, brief, almost too fast to catch, but Charlotte caught it anyway. A tightening around the eyes, a stillness that hadn't been there a half-second before. "Is that so?" Kane said slowly. "And how's that proceeding?" "Better than expected," Charlotte said, watching him carefully now. Some instinct she couldn't yet name telling her his interest in that horse ran deeper than polite curiosity. "I'd love to see him," Kane said. "I do have something of an eye for horseflesh." "Now ain't the time," Cole said before Charlotte could answer. "We've got business to discuss, and I'd rather do it quick and be done with you." Kane's smile finally slipped just at the edges. "As you like. Let's discuss it then." They moved toward the porch steps, Kane's 2 silent riders remaining mounted near the gate, and Charlotte found herself trailing a few steps behind, unwilling to be dismissed from a conversation that concerned the very ground she was standing on. "I'll make this simple, Nathaniel," Kane said, settling into a porch chair he hadn't been offered. "Your note comes due in 8 weeks, given recent events." His eyes flicked briefly toward the direction of the corral, toward the fresh grave beyond it. "I imagine meeting that deadline just became considerably harder. I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for the land now before the bank forces a far less generous outcome later." "My answer's the same as it's been every time you've asked," Cole said. "This land isn't for sale." "Everything's for sale, Nathaniel. It's simply a matter of price and timing, and I'd say your timing has never been worse." Kane leaned forward slightly. "You lost a hand this week. Your stud contract with Fort Carrington hangs on a horse that's already proven he'll kill a man who gets too close. I'd hate to see you lose everything for the sake of stubbornness. And I'd hate for you to keep pretending you care one lick about what I lose," Cole said, "when we both know you've wanted this valley since before Tom Riley ever drew breath on it." The air between them went tight and cold. You wound me, Kane said, though his voice carried no wound in it at all. I'm simply a businessman recognizing opportunity. Opportunity for what exactly? Charlotte asked. Kane's eyes cut to her sharp and assessing. I beg your pardon. You keep saying you want this land, she said. But you've never once said why. Cattlemen buy grazing land. Farmers buy river frontage. What is it you're after, Mr. Kane, that's got you circling this ranch like a buzzard 3 years running? Something behind Kane's eyes went very still, very careful. A woman with sharp questions, he said. How refreshing. She asked you something plain, Cole said. Answer it. Kane rose from the chair, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve, his smile returning thinner, now more practiced. I don't believe I owe explanations to hired help Nathaniel, however capable she may prove with troubled horses. He stepped down from the porch. 8 weeks. Think on my offer. It won't stay generous forever. He turned toward his horse, and it was in that exact moment, as he crossed the yard toward the gate, that Kane's scream tore across the ranch. It wasn't the sound of a horse startled by noise or movement. It was something deeper, something almost human in its fury, a shriek of rage and terror combined, that sent every man in the yard reaching for a weapon or a rail to grab hold of. Charlotte's head snapped toward the corral. Kane was rearing front hooves, slashing the air, eyes wild, a sound coming out of him she'd never heard from any horse in 15 years of gentling broken animals. And his gaze, wide, white-rimmed, murderous, was locked directly on Silas Kane. Get him back, Cole shouted at his men. Get everybody back from that fence. But Charlotte wasn't looking at the fence. She was looking at Kane, who had gone utterly rigid beside his horse, face drained of every ounce of its practiced composure, staring at the screaming stallion like a man staring at a ghost he'd buried a long time ago and never expected to see walk again. You know him, Charlotte said low, disbelieving. You know that horse. Kane's jaw worked. For just a moment, one unguarded, terrible moment, something raw and afraid moved behind his eyes. Then it vanished, replaced instantly by cold irritation. Nonsense, he said too quickly. The animal's simply spooked by strangers. It's hardly a mystery given his temperament. He mounted his horse in one sharp, practiced motion. 8 weeks, Nathaniel. I'd advise you use them wisely. He wheeled his horse and rode out with his men at a pace just fast enough to look like urgency rather than flight, leaving behind a yard full of shaken ranch hands and a stallion still screaming at the empty space where he'd stood. Charlotte watched him go, mind racing, every instinct she'd honed over 15 years of reading frightened animals, screaming the same conclusion. That horse hadn't reacted to a stranger. He'd reacted to a memory. It took nearly 20 minutes for Kane to settle enough that Charlotte dared approach the fence again. Cole stood beside her rifle, forgotten at his side, his face a mixture of confusion and something harder, something calculating. You saw his face, Charlotte said quietly. When Kane screamed, you saw it same as I did. I saw a man startled by a violent animal, Cole said, though his voice lacked conviction. That wasn't startled, Mr. Cole. Startled is a jump, a flinch, a hand going to a weapon. That was recognition. That was a man seeing something he thought he'd left buried. She turned to face him fully. Where did that drover say he bought this horse originally, before he sold him to you? Nebraska, he said. Some outfit up near the territory line. Kane's from Nebraska, Charlotte said slowly, watching the realization dawn across Cole's face, even as she spoke it. You told me yesterday. Made his money in cattle up there before he came south. Cole's expression darkened. You think Kane owned this horse? I think that horse looked at him and saw the reason he can't stand to have a man walk within 10 feet of him, Charlotte said. I think somebody hurt this animal so badly he'd rather kill a stranger than risk it happening again. And I think we just watched that somebody ride out your front gate smiling like nothing at all was wrong. Cole stared toward the empty road where Kane's dust was still settling. If that's true, Charlotte said, Then Silas Kane isn't just after your land, Mr. Cole. He's got a history with this horse. He doesn't want anybody digging up, and men like that don't take kindly to women asking sharp questions on porches. Ruth found Charlotte an hour later, sitting alone on the overturned feed bucket outside the corral, watching Kane graze in restless, wary circles at the far end of the enclosure. "Papa says you made the bad man leave," Ruth said, climbing up to sit on the fence rail a cautious distance away. "I didn't make anybody do anything," Charlotte said. "Kane did that all on his own." "Otis says you knew something about him, about the bad man." Charlotte considered how much truth a child that age deserved. She'd learned from her own girlhood that half-truths dressed up as protection had a way of curdling into something worse when the real truth finally surfaced. "I think Kane's met Mr. Kane before," she said carefully. "A long time ago, and I don't think it was a kind meeting." Ruth's eyes went wide. "Is that why he's so scared all the time?" "Might be part of it, yes. But you're not scared of Mr. Kane." Charlotte glanced at the girl, surprised by the observation. "What makes you say that? You asked him questions nobody else asks him. Papa always just says no and walks away. You asked him why." "Sometimes asking why is the bravest thing a person can do," Charlotte said. "Braver than fighting even. Fighting's easy once you've decided to do it. Asking why means admitting you don't have all the answers yet, and that scares some people worse than any gunfight." Ruth was quiet a moment, swinging her legs against the fence rail, watching Kane graze. "Do you think he'll ever let me pet him?" she asked. "Like a regular horse." "I think," Charlotte said, slowly watching the stallion's ears swivel toward the sound of the girl's voice without the usual flattened aggression, "that he might someday. If we're patient. If we don't ask more of him than he's ready to give." "That's what you keep saying. Patient. It's the only thing that's ever worked in my experience. With horses. With people too, though people are usually worse at admitting they need it." Ruth studied Charlotte for a long moment with the particular seriousness only children seem able to summon. "Papa's been sad a real long time," she said. "Since Mama." Charlotte's chest tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I imagine he has. He doesn't laugh much anymore. He used to laugh a lot. I don't hardly remember it, but Martha says he used to." "Grief does that to a person," Charlotte said quietly. "It doesn't take the laughing away forever, just for a while, sometimes a long while." She looked toward the house where she could see Cole's shape moving past a window, restless, still turning over the morning's revelations. "But it does come back. Eventually. If a person lets it." Ruth nodded slowly, filing the words away the way children do, and for a moment the two of them sat in comfortable silence, watching a wounded animal graze in wary circles. Both of them carrying grief they'd learned to wear like a second skin. Yet, that night, long after the ranch had gone dark and quiet, Charlotte woke to a sound that didn't belong. Not Kane's pacing. She'd grown used to that rhythm, already could distinguish it in her sleep from any other noise on the property. This was different. Quieter, deliberate. The soft scrape of boots against dry earth moving careful and slow along the fence line toward the corral. She was up and dressed before she'd fully decided to move, easing her door open without a sound, slipping out into the dark yard with her heart hammering against her ribs. The shape near the fence resolved slowly into a man, not one of Cole's hands, not anyone she recognized from the ranch at all, crouched low near the corral's far post, working something in his hands against the wood. Charlotte's breath caught. She thought of the loose top rail Kane had rattled that first afternoon, thought of Cole's warning about the fence being fragile, and understood in one cold instant exactly what she was watching. "Hey!" she shouted, and the shape bolted instantly, crashing away through the dark toward the tree line, before she could get close enough to see a face. Lanterns flared to life across the yard within seconds. Cole came out of the house, half-dressed rifle already in hand, Otis and two other hands right behind him. "What happened?" Cole demanded, reaching her side. "Someone was at the fence," Charlotte said, still breathing hard, pointing toward the tree line where the intruder had vanished. "Working at the post. I think he meant to weaken it. Cole's face went through several things at once: fear, fury, and finally a grim, cold understanding. Kane, he said. We don't know that for certain, Charlotte said, though her own suspicion sat just as heavy in her chest. We don't need to know it for certain, Cole said. We know he wants this land bad enough to threaten it. We know that horse recognized him this morning like he'd crawled straight up out of a nightmare. And now somebody's out here in the dark trying to weaken the one fence keeping that animal from running loose and proving to the whole county he's too dangerous to keep alive. His jaw was tight, his knuckles white around the rifle stock. Otis, get the men up. I want somebody at this fence line every hour till sunup. Yes, boss. Charlotte moved toward the corral, checking the post the intruder had been working at by lantern light, and found the wood scored and splintered near the base weakened just enough that another few nights of Kane's frustrated pacing might have brought the whole section down. If he'd gotten loose, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone, running scared through open country, half mad with fear already. He'd have been shot on sight by the first rider who crossed his path. Cole finished grimly. And Kane would have had exactly the excuse he needed. Dangerous animal danger to the county ranch, too troubled to be worth the note. He looked at her, something new in his expression now, something that hadn't been there the day before. You saved that horse's life tonight, Miss Reed, same as you might have saved this whole ranch. I didn't save anything, Charlotte said, though something in her chest warmed despite the exhaustion pulling at her. I just happened to wake up at the right moment. Don't do that, Cole said quietly. Do what? Make yourself smaller than what you did. I've watched you do it twice now since you got here. Somebody pays you a fair word, and you find a way to hand it back like it don't belong to you. His eyes held hers in the lantern light, steady and searching. You earned that word, Charlotte. Might do you some good to let yourself keep it just this once. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something in the sound of it, low and unpracticed in his mouth, settled somewhere deep and unguarded inside her chest. I'm not used to people noticing, she admitted quietly. Well, Cole said something almost gentle in his voice now. I reckon it's about time somebody started. Morning came grim and gray, the kind of exhausted daylight that follows a night nobody truly slept through. Otis found Charlotte at the corral before breakfast, arms crossed, expression unreadable, in a new way, no longer purely skeptical, but not yet fully convinced either. Heard you caught somebody at the fence last night, he said. Didn't catch him, scared him off. Same thing that matters far as I'm concerned. He shifted his weight, looking almost uncomfortable with what he said next. I owe you an apology, maybe. Been running my mouth since you got here about you not belonging, about this being a fool's errand. He nodded toward Kane, who stood watching them both from across the corral, tense but no longer frantic. Horse looks calmer than I've seen him look in 3 days, and you're the only one who's managed that. Apology accepted, Charlotte said, though you don't owe me one, Mr. Pruitt. Your doubt was reasonable. Most trainers who claim they can gentle a killer horse in a week are lying or fooling themselves. I understand why you didn't believe me. And now I've got 6 days left and a horse who's stopped trying to kill the fence every time I get near it. That's not nothing, but it's not victory yet either. Otis studied her a moment longer, then nodded once, sharp and final, the closest thing to genuine respect she'd get from a man built out of stubbornness and grief. Boss wants you at the house. Something about papers Kane left behind by accident yesterday. Wants your eyes on him before he decides what to do. Charlotte's pulse quickened. Papers. Fell out of his coat when he mounted up in a hurry, is my guess, on account of that horse near about giving him a heart attack. One of the boys found him in the dirt this morning. She found Cole at the kitchen table, a small bundle of documents spread before him. His expression dark and focused in a way that told her whatever he'd found had confirmed his worst suspicions. Look at this, he said, sliding a page toward her as she sat. Charlotte scanned it quickly. A bill of sale dated some years back, transferring ownership of a black stallion unnamed, marked only by a distinctive scar on the left hip from a ranching outfit in Nebraska, to a drover identified only by initials. The seller's name at the bottom was unmistakable. Silas Kane. He owned him, Charlotte breathed. He owned Kane and sold him off cheap to some drover. And then that drover sold him to you for even less. And neither one of you ever knew the truth of where he came from. There's more, Cole said grimly, pushing a second page toward her. This one was rougher, a hastily scrawled note rather than a formal document, but the words on it turned Charlotte's stomach cold. Get rid of the black one before the army inspector comes through. Can't have questions asked about how he got that scar. Whatever it takes. Whatever it takes, Charlotte repeated quietly. Mr. Cole, this isn't just about land anymore. If Kane hurt that horse badly enough to leave a scar like that badly enough to need him gone before an army inspection, then he's got more buried than a bad business reputation, Cole finished. He's got something criminal he's spent years making sure never surfaces. He sat back, rubbing a hand across his tired face. No wonder he's so desperate to buy this land out from under me before that stud contract with Fort Carrington ever gets fulfilled. An army inspector poking around this ranch looking that horse over close might see exactly what he saw yesterday morning, a scar that tells a story Kane spent years burying. Charlotte's mind was racing now, pieces sliding together with a clarity that made her chest tight with something between fear and fierce determined hope. If we can gentle him, she said slowly. If we can get Kane calm enough, healthy enough, ready for that army contract, Kane loses everything he's been trying to prevent. Not just the land, the truth. And if we can't, Cole said, voice low, he's got 6 days left to make sure that horse never sees an army inspector at all, one way or another. Outside, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of Kane's hooves against the corral fence, not frantic this morning, but steady, insistent like a heartbeat refusing to be silenced. Charlotte rose from the table, already moving toward the door, toward the animal who held inside him, the one truth Silas Kane could never afford to let the world see. Then I suppose, she said, we'd better make sure he doesn't get the chance. Cole spent the better part of the morning locked away with the documents Kane had left behind. And by the time he emerged onto the porch, his face had settled into something colder and more determined than Charlotte had yet seen on him. I sent Otis to the telegraph office, he said. Wired Fort Carrington directly. Told them the stallion's progressing faster than expected, asked if the inspector might come early instead of waiting out the full month. Charlotte's stomach dropped. Mr. Cole, he's not ready. Not near ready. Another week, maybe 2. I know what you told me, Cole said, cutting her off, though not unkindly. But think it through with me. Kane's desperate enough to send a man sneaking around my fence in the dark. He's not going to wait patiently while we take our time gentling that horse proper. Every day we stretch this out is another day he's got to finish what he started last night. He looked toward the corral, jaw tight. I'd rather have that inspector standing in my yard sooner than later. Official army business, plain for anybody to see. Kane won't dare try anything with a federal man on the property. And if Kane panics in front of him, if he's not ready and he throws a fit that convinces the army he's unfit for any contract at all, then we've lost the contract, Cole said grimly. But we'll still have our lives, and that horse will still be breathing. I'd take that trade every time over waiting for Kane to burn us out. Charlotte wanted to argue further, wanted to insist that rushing an animal who'd spent years learning that humans meant pain would only confirm every fear he carried. But she understood, too, the particular arithmetic of a man protecting his daughter's future against a threat that had already proven it wasn't above violence. She swallowed the argument down. How soon, she asked instead, before you hear back? Wired this morning. Ryder ought to bring an answer by evening if we're lucky. Then I've got today, Charlotte said, already turning toward the corral, and I intend to use every hour of it. Kane watched her climb the fence with less alarm than he had the day before, a small mercy, but one she registered gratefully, filing it away as evidence that patience, however slow, was not wasted. She settled onto the ground in her usual spot 20 feet distant and let the morning stretch out in silence between them. His ears, she noticed, no longer pinned flat the instant she appeared. They swiveled, listening, uncertain, but no longer purely hostile. "You heard him yesterday," she said quietly, not moving, not looking at him directly. "Kane. You heard his voice, and you knew exactly who he was, didn't you?" Kane's tail flicked. He took 2 steps closer, stopped, watched her. "I don't need you to tell me what he did," Charlotte continued, voice low and even. "I've got a fair guess already, and it isn't a kind one. But I need you to understand something, if there's any part of you capable of understanding a stranger's words at all." She let a long breath out. "He can't hurt you again. Not while I'm standing here. I know that promise doesn't mean much yet. I know you've heard promises before, probably from men who broke them the very next moment. But I intend to keep mine, even if it takes me the rest of my life to prove it." The stallion took another step, then another. 18 feet. 15. Charlotte's heart hammered, but she kept her body loose, her breathing slow, her hands open and visible in her lap. 12 feet. He stopped there, chest heaving, eyes fixed on her with an intensity that felt less like threat now, and more like desperate searching question. "Are you different? Are you actually different? Or are you just better at hiding what you want from me?" "I'm not going to reach for you," Charlotte said softly. "Not today. You don't have to decide anything today." Kane stood a long moment, trembling faintly, then wheeled and trotted back to the far rail, but Charlotte noted with something warm blooming in her chest, despite the fear still coiled there, that he didn't run. He simply walked. That, in the language she'd spent 15 years learning to speak, was nearly a sentence. The rider from town arrived just before supper, dust-covered and breathless, with a telegram clutched in his fist that he delivered straight into Cole's waiting hand. Charlotte watched from the porch steps as Cole read it, watched his expression shift from tense anticipation into something that made her stomach drop clean through the floorboards. "What?" she said. "What does it say?" "Inspector's coming early," Cole said, voice tight. "Day after tomorrow. Day after tomorrow." Charlotte's voice cracked with disbelief. "Mr. Cole, that's not enough time. That's not near enough time. Yesterday he let me sit 12 feet away without bolting. That is not a horse ready to stand for an army inspection in 2 days. I know what I asked for," Cole said, and to his credit there was no triumph in his voice, only the grim weight of a man who understood exactly what he'd gambled and lost some of the safety net in the doing. "I thought I was buying us protection. Seems the army moves faster than I accounted for when there's a contract worth this much sitting on the table. Then we've traded one danger for another," Charlotte said. "Kane running out of time to sabotage us quietly, and now us running out of time to actually be ready." Behind them, the screen door creaked, and Ruth's small voice cut into the tension. "Is the horseman coming to take Kane away?" Cole turned, some of the hardness in his face softening instantly at the sight of his daughter. "No, sweetheart. Nobody's taking him anywhere. Man's just coming to look him over is all. Will Kane be scared?" Charlotte crouched down to the girl's level before Cole could answer. "He might be some. New people scare him something fierce, same as you saw with Mr. Kane yesterday. But we're going to do everything we can these next 2 days to help him feel steadier." "Can I help?" Ruth asked. "Absolutely not," Cole said immediately. "Papa. That horse killed a man 4 days ago, Ruth. I'm not risking you anywhere near that corral, and that's the end of it." Ruth's face crumpled, not into tears exactly, but into the particular stubborn hurt of a child told no, without explanation, good enough to satisfy her. She turned and stomped back into the house, and Cole exhaled hard through his nose, watching her go. "She doesn't understand," he said quietly. "She understands more than you think," Charlotte said. "She just doesn't like being on the outside of something that scares her. That's not childishness, Mr. Cole. That's the exact same thing driving every person on this ranch, grown or otherwise." Cole looked at her a long moment. "You think I should let her closer to this?" "I think," Charlotte said carefully, "that fear handled from a safe distance with somebody steady beside her might do her more good than being shut out entirely and left to imagine the worst on her own. But that's your decision to make, not mine. I've got no business telling a father how to raise his daughter. No, Cole admitted. But you're not wrong either, and that's twice. Now you've told me something I didn't want to hear, and turned out to be right about it. He glanced toward the corral, toward the dark shape of the stallion settling into evening stillness. 2 days, he murmured. God help us. Tut. Night fell heavy and watchful over the ranch, every hand assigned an hour at the fence line, rifles loaded, nerves stretched thin as fence wire. Charlotte couldn't sleep. She sat at her window a long while watching the lantern light move along the corral perimeter, before finally giving up on rest entirely and pulling her boots back on. She found Cole exactly where she expected, at the fence alone, rifle across his knees, staring at Kane's dark shape standing motionless in the far corner of the pen. Couldn't sleep either, she said, settling onto the rail beside him. Keep running numbers in my head, he admitted. 2 days. What that inspector's going to see. What happens to this ranch, to Ruth, to every man who works this land if it goes wrong? He rubbed a hand across his face, exhaustion carved deep into the lines around his eyes. I keep thinking about Tom, too. About how I stood right here and watched him die. And how easy it'd be to watch it happen again if I let myself hope too hard about what you're doing with that horse. You're allowed to hope, Charlotte said quietly. Hoping isn't what got Tom killed, Mr. Cole. Standing too close to a scared animal without understanding him first is what got Tom killed. Those aren't the same thing, even if grief tries to convince you they are. Cole was quiet a long moment. You said your husband died breaking a colt, he said finally. Did you hope before it happened? Did you let yourself believe it'd turn out fine? Charlotte's chest tightened, old grief rising sharp and sudden, the way it still sometimes did, even 2 years distant. Every single time, she said softly. Every time he climbed into a pen with something green and unbroken, I told myself this was the day nothing would go wrong. I never once stopped hoping, even the morning it happened. And that didn't teach you to stop. No, Charlotte said, surprising herself with how certain the answer came. It taught me that hope was never the mistake. The mistake was believing hope alone was enough without patience and understanding standing right alongside it. Daniel was a good man. Mr. Cole better than most, but he believed strength and stubbornness could out-argue any animal's fear. I don't believe that. I never have. I believe fear only answers to patience. And patience is the one thing this whole valley seems determined not to give that horse. Cole studied her in the dim lantern light, something shifting behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not pity, not simple respect, but something warmer, more complicated that made Charlotte's pulse stumble unexpectedly. You're an unusual woman, Charlotte Reed, he said quietly. I've been told that plenty of times, she said, usually not as a compliment. I meant it as one. The silence that followed held something neither of them quite dared name, stretched thin and fragile between two people who'd both learned the hard way that letting yourself want something usually meant setting yourself up to lose it. Charlotte looked away first, back toward Kane's dark shape in the corral, and cleared her throat. We should both try to sleep, she said. 2 days isn't much time, and I intend to use every hour of daylight we've got left. Cole nodded slowly, though he didn't move right away, and for a moment longer they simply sat together in the dark, watching a wounded animal breathe steady in his sleep, both of them carrying the same fragile, dangerous thing neither was ready to call by its true name. Dawn broke with gunfire. Charlotte was out of bed and running before she'd even fully registered the sound boot's half-laced heart slamming against her ribs as she burst out into a yard, thrown into chaos. Men shouting, horses, screaming, and beyond it all, unmistakable. Even through the panic, Kane's furious scream rising above everything else. Fire! Otis was bellowing, sprinting toward the barn, where flame had already caught along one wall. Orange light licking hungry against the pre-dawn dark. Fire in the barn. Get the water. Charlotte's eyes cut toward the corral, and her stomach dropped clean through the ground. The gate stood wide open. Kane was gone. Cole? she screamed, already running toward the broken gate, toward the fresh hoofprints tearing away into the dark beyond the ranch's boundary. Cole. He's loose. Cole appeared at her side seconds later, rifle in hand, face white with fury and fear in equal measure. Same men, he snarled, taking in the smashed gate hinge, the deliberate cut of rope that had once secured it. Kane's men, had to be. Burn the barn for distraction, cut the horse loose, while everybody's fighting flame, let him run wild till somebody puts a bullet in him for being dangerous, or till he runs himself straight into a ravine in the dark, panicked out of his mind. Charlotte said, already moving toward the nearest saddled horse. I'm going after him. Absolutely not, Cole said, grabbing her arm. It's pitch dark. There's men out there with guns who just tried to burn my barn down, and that horse is running scared enough to trample anything that gets near him. I am not losing you the same night I nearly lose everything else, and I am not letting that animal die alone in the dark after everything he survived to get this far, Charlotte said, pulling free, swinging up onto the horse before Cole could stop her. I know his fear better than any man on this ranch, Nathaniel. If anyone can bring him back without a bullet, it's me. She was gone before he could argue further. Hooves pounding into the dark, the ranch's chaos and firelight shrinking behind her as she followed the scattered, panicked trail of prints leading off into open country. She found him nearly a mile out, standing rigid at the edge of a dry ravine chest, heaving eyes wild and white-rimmed in the thin gray light beginning to touch the eastern sky. He'd run himself to exhaustion, but exhaustion hadn't dulled the terror. If anything, it had sharpened. It stripped away whatever fragile calm she'd built over 3 careful days, and left nothing behind but raw, cornered fear. Charlotte slid off her horse a good 50 feet back and approached on foot. Slow, hands open, heart hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. Easy, she murmured, voice barely above a whisper. Easy now. I know somebody tried to hurt you again. I know the fire, the noise, all of it. I know exactly what that felt like, waking into chaos with no warning at all. Kane's ears pinned. He tossed his head, took a stamping step sideways along the ravine's edge, close enough to the drop that Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. Don't, she said softly. Don't you go over that edge trying to run from something that isn't chasing you anymore. Look at me. It's just me. No fire, no gun, no rope. Behind her, faint but growing louder, she heard hoofbeats. Cole, she realized, ignoring every ounce of good sense and following her out into the dark despite what she'd said. She didn't turn. She couldn't afford to not, with Kane trembling on the edge of a drop that could kill him in an instant if his panic tipped the wrong direction. Charlotte. Cole's voice carried across the dark, edged with fear. Charlotte, get back from him. He's too close to that edge. Stay there. Charlotte called back, not taking her eyes off the horse. Nathaniel, I mean it. Stay exactly where you are. If he bolts toward your voice, he could go straight over. She heard Cole's horse stop, heard him swing down anyway, boots hitting dirt, and prayed he had sense enough to stay put, despite everything in him clearly screaming to close the distance. It's just us, she said again, softer, now taking one more careful step toward the stallion. 40 feet. 35. Just like it's been every day since I climbed into that corral. Nobody here is going to hurt you. I know that's hard to believe after everything. I know trust doesn't come easy to something that's been broken this many times. Kane's front hooves scraped at the loose dirt near the ravine's edge, dangerously close now, small stones skittering down into the dark below. Charlotte's heart lurched into her throat, but she forced her voice to stay, even forced her feet to keep moving slow and steady instead of freezing where she stood. I lost my husband to a horse's fear. She said the words spilling out unplanned, raw, and unguarded in a way she'd never let them be with any living soul. I lost my home right along with him. I know what it costs giving your whole heart to something and watching it get torn away by circumstances neither of you asked for. I know exactly how much easier it would be to just keep running, keep fighting, keep trusting nothing and nobody ever again. 20 feet now, 15. But I'm standing here anyway, because I decided somewhere along the way that being alone and safe wasn't worth as much as being scared and trying. And I think somewhere under all that fear, you might understand exactly what I mean. Kane's ears flicked toward her voice. His trembling didn't stop, but it slowed just slightly. Just enough. 10 feet. I'm not going to grab you, Charlotte said. I'm not going to rope you or force you anywhere you don't choose to go. I'm just going to stand here close, as you'll let me, and let you decide. She stopped moving, stood still, hands open at her sides, breath held so tight, her chest ached with it. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Kane stood trembling at the ravine's edge, eyes fixed on her chest, heaving caught between two instincts that had governed his entire existence, run or trust, flight or something terrifyingly close to hope. Then, slow as a held breath finally released, he took one step toward her. Then another. Charlotte didn't move, didn't breathe, watched him close the final distance between them until his muzzle hovered inches from her outstretched hand. Hot breath ghosting across her palm, his whole massive body still trembling with residual terror, but no longer fighting to flee. There, she whispered. Tears she hadn't realized were falling, slipping silent down her face. There you are. Slowly, achingly slow, she raised her hand those final inches and pressed her palm flat against the warm plane of his cheek. Kane didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He stood trembling and exhausted and utterly finally still, allowing a human touch for what she suspected was the first time in longer than anyone on that ranch could guess. Behind her she heard Cole's breath catch audibly across the distance, heard him whisper something that might have been her name or might have been a prayer, and for one suspended perfect moment, the whole terrible night narrowed down to nothing but the warmth of a wounded animal finally choosing to believe her. It was Otis who found the second saboteur, not one of Kane's silent riders from the porch visit, but a lanky, nervous man named Purnell, who'd been hired on as a temporary hand only 2 weeks prior, caught trying to slip away from the property in the chaos with a half-empty coal oil can still clutched in his hand. By the time Charlotte led Kane back into the yard on a lead rope he'd allowed almost without protest, the barn fire was smoldering out under buckets of water and stubborn effort, and Purnell sat bound to a porch post, sweating and pale, surrounded by ranch hands, whose fury had curdled into something considerably more frightening than shouting. "Talk," Cole said, standing over him, voice low and dangerous in a way Charlotte hadn't heard from him before. "Who sent you?" "I don't know what you're—" "You had coal oil in your hand, and my barn burning behind you," Cole said. "Don't waste my patience lying to me twice in one night. Who sent you?" Purnell's eyes darted toward the corral toward Kane, standing calm now beside Charlotte, and something in that sight seemed to break whatever resolve he'd been clinging to. "Kane," he said finally, voice cracking. "Silas Kane. Paid me and 2 others good money to burn the barn, cut the horse loose in the confusion. Said if the animal ran off and got shot by some rider mistaking him for a threat, that'd solve his problem clean, no questions asked." "What problem?" Charlotte said, stepping forward. "Say it plain. What problem does Kane have with that horse specifically?" Purnell hesitated, glancing between them, weighing fear of Kane against the very immediate fear of the men surrounding him now. "Said the horse used to belong to him," he said finally. "Years back up in Nebraska. Said there was an incident, some kind of accident during a breaking session gone bad, and a man died on his property on account of it. Said the horse marked him bad, that scar on his hip from where Kane's own foreman took a hot iron to him, trying to break his spirit after out of spite for what happened. Kane got rid of him quiet after that, sold him off before word could spread and ruin his standing with the Army contracts he was chasing even back then." Purnell swallowed hard. Said if that horse ever stood calm enough for an Army inspector to look him over close, somebody might recognize that scar for what it really was, might start asking questions about what really happened up in Nebraska, and Kane's whole reputation with every fort and outfit in the territory would come crashing down around him. Charlotte felt the truth of it settle into her chest like a stone, cold and heavy, and finally terribly clear. Every violent outburst, every panicked scream, every desperate refusal to let a human hand come near all of it, traced back to a single act of cruelty inflicted years ago by a man who'd since spent a fortune making sure nobody ever connected the dots. He killed a man, Cole said slowly, and instead of answering for it, he tortured the horse who survived it and sold him off to keep the truth buried. That's what I heard, Purnell said miserably. That's all I know, I swear it. I just needed the money is all. Didn't think about what it'd cost till I was standing in that barn watching flame catch faster than I meant it to. Cole straightened fury, and something like triumph warring across his face in equal measure. You're going to tell the sheriff every word of that, he said, and you're going to tell that army inspector the same when he arrives tomorrow, or I promise you the consequences waiting on my land will feel considerably friendlier than what's waiting on you in a courtroom. Purnell nodded fast, desperate, and Cole turned away from him toward Charlotte, toward Kane, standing quiet and exhausted beside her in the gray light of a dawn that had nearly cost them everything. You did it, Cole said, voice rough with something too large to fully name. You actually did it. Charlotte looked at the stallion, at the trust in his dark eyes that had been earned through nothing but patience and honesty and the particular hard-won understanding of a woman who'd survived her own devastating losses to grief. We did it, she corrected quietly. All of us, him included. Kane, as if understanding, lowered his great head and pressed his muzzle briefly against her shoulder, and behind them, exhausted and soot-streaked and disbelieving every hand on that ranch, who'd once doubted her, stood watching in a silence that finally fully held nothing but respect. The sheriff arrived within the hour, summoned by one of the ranch hands who'd ridden hard into town the moment Purnell's confession finished spilling out onto the porch. Sheriff Amos Whitfield was a broad, unhurried man who'd worn the badge in that county for the better part of 2 decades, and he listened to Purnell's account with the particular patience of someone who'd learned long ago not to react until every fact had settled. You're telling me, he said slowly, chewing the end of an unlit cigar, that Silas Kane paid you to burn a barn and loose a dangerous animal, all to keep a federal inspector from getting too good a look at an old scar? Yes, sir, Purnell said, sweat still beading at his temple despite the cool morning air. That's the truth of it, far as I know. Whitfield turned his gaze on Cole, then on Charlotte, then finally on Kane, who stood calm beside the corral fence, now watching the gathered men with wary but no longer frantic attention. That's a serious accusation, Whitfield said. Man like Kane's got friends in the territory, judges, bankers. This isn't going to be settled on the word of a hired hand caught red-handed trying to save his own skin. There's more than his word, Cole said, retrieving the documents from inside his coat, the bill of sale and the scrawled note both. Kane's own handwriting, his own signature. Proves he owned that horse, proves he wanted him gone quiet before an army inspection could ask questions. Whitfield took the papers, studied them a long moment, his expression shifting from professional neutrality into something harder, more focused. Where'd you get these? Kane dropped them himself, Charlotte said. Fell out of his coat in his hurry to leave after that horse recognized him, and about took the yard apart in fear. That horse recognized him, Whitfield repeated, glancing again at Kane. You're certain of that? I've spent 15 years reading Fear in Animals, Sheriff, Charlotte said. I know the difference between a horse startled by a stranger and a horse confronting a nightmare he thought he'd escaped. That was the second kind. Whitfield was quiet a long moment, turning the papers over in his hands, weighing the word of a hired hand and a horse trainer against the standing of one of the wealthiest men in the territory. I'll need to speak with Kane directly, he said finally. Give him chance to answer these accusations proper, but I'll tell you this. He tucked the papers carefully into his own coat. A signed bill of sale and a note talking about getting rid of evidence before an inspection is a sight more than idle gossip. This is worth looking into, serious, and I intend to. And in the meantime, Cole asked, the inspector's due tomorrow. If Kane hears the sheriff's asking questions, there's no telling what he tries next. In the meantime, Whitfield said, I'll have a deputy posted here through tomorrow official business, keeping an eye on things till this settles one way or the other. He glanced toward Purnell, still bound to the porch post. And this one's coming with me. He'll answer for the barn regardless of what happens with Cain. As they led Purnell away, Charlotte felt some of the night's terror finally begin to loosen its grip on her chest. Though a new, quieter worry took its place almost immediately, the knowledge that Cain, cornered now, and dangerous, wasn't likely to simply accept defeat without one final desperate move. The deputy arrived by midday, a young serious man named Beckett, who took up a post near the ranch gate with the solemn attentiveness of someone determined to prove himself worthy of the assignment. His presence did little to ease the tension that had settled over the ranch like a held breath, but it did at least allow Charlotte to return her full attention to Cain, who stood in the corral, bearing the marks of the night's trauma in every tense line of his body. She entered the pen slowly, mindful of how far his trust had been tested in the hours since dawn. "I know," she said softly, settling into her usual spot closer now than she'd ever dared before. "I know last night undid some of what we built. That's all right. We'll build it again." Cain watched her ears, swiveling body wary, but no longer coiled for flight. After a long moment, he took a step closer. Then another. Behind her at the fence, Ruth's small voice carried across the yard. "Papa, can I go closer? Please, I want to see him up close just once." Charlotte turned to find Cole standing with his daughter at the fence rail, clearly caught in the middle of an argument he'd been losing for some time. "Ruth?" "You said he let Charlotte pet him," Ruth pressed. "You said he was calm now. I just want to see him, Papa. I'm not asking to touch him." Cole looked toward Charlotte, a silent question in his eyes. Charlotte considered it a long moment, watching Cain's reaction to the girl's voice ears, turning toward the sound, curious rather than alarmed, no trace of the panic that had gripped him at Cain's presence. "He might do all right with it," Charlotte said carefully. "If she stays at the fence, doesn't reach for him, lets him decide the distance, same as I did. I won't promise it'll go smooth, Mr. Cole, but I don't think it'll go dangerous either." Cole hesitated another moment, then finally nodded, lifting Ruth up so she could see over the top rail without climbing through it. "Stay right there," he said firmly. "You don't reach for him unless Charlotte says it's all right. You understand me?" "I understand," Ruth said, practically vibrating with excitement despite her father's stern tone. Charlotte rose slowly and approached the fence, standing beside the little girl, keeping her voice soft and even. "Cain," she said, "this is Ruth. She's been wanting to meet you a long while now." The stallion's dark eyes fixed on the child, assessing cautious. Ruth, for her part, went very still, hands folded carefully against the top rail, watching him with the same unguarded wonder she'd shown watching Charlotte those first uncertain days. "He's so big," Ruth whispered. "He is," Charlotte agreed. "And he's been very brave, letting so many new things happen to him lately. Same as you have, I'd wager, watching all of this unfold." Ruth glanced up at her, surprised. "I haven't been brave. I've just been scared, mostly." "That's what brave means, sweetheart," Charlotte said. "Doing the thing anyway, even while you're scared. You climbed up to this fence today, knowing that Horse killed a man not a week past. That's not nothing. That's exactly the kind of brave I've been trying to teach him, matter of fact." Ruth considered this with the particular seriousness of a child turning over new and important information. Slowly, carefully, she extended one small hand toward the fence, not through the rails, just resting near the edge, palm open. Cain watched the gesture a long moment. Then, to the audible gasp of every adult present, he took 2 slow steps forward and lowered his great head, breathing warm and curious across the girl's outstretched fingers. Ruth's face broke into an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy that made Charlotte's throat tighten unexpectedly. Beside her, Cole made a small, strangled sound that was equal parts fear and wonder, his hand tightening reflexively on the fence rail, as if he might need to yank his daughter back at any instant. "He likes me," Ruth breathed. "He trusts you," Charlotte corrected gently, "which is a good deal rarer and a good deal more precious, if you ask me." Cole met Charlotte's eyes across his daughter's head, and in that look, she saw something that hadn't fully surfaced before. Not just gratitude, not just growing respect, but something warmer and more dangerous. something that made her pulse stumble the same way it had 2 nights before at the fence in the dark. "You've done something here," he said quietly, "that I didn't think was possible 5 days ago." "We're not finished yet," Charlotte said, though she felt the truth of his words settle warm in her chest despite herself. "Tomorrow's inspection is going to test every bit of ground we've gained." "I know," Cole said. "But whatever happens tomorrow, Charlotte, this right here watching my daughter touch that horse without fear for the first time in her life, this already happened. Nobody can take that back whatever else comes." Evening brought a different kind of tension, one that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the careful, uncertain territory 2 grieving people found themselves navigating without a map. Charlotte found herself lingering on the porch after supper, unwilling to retreat to her room just yet, and Cole joined her there, without needing to be asked, settling onto the step beside her with 2 cups of coffee he'd made himself. "Martha usually handles this," he said, handing her a cup, "but she's worn thin from the day, same as everybody else." "Thank you," Charlotte said, wrapping her hands around the warmth of it. They sat in comfortable silence a while, watching the last light fade over the ranch. The deputy's silhouette visible near the gate, Kane's shape settled and calm in the corral for the first time since she'd arrived. "Ruth talked about you all through supper," Cole said eventually. "Wouldn't stop, matter of fact. Charlotte said this. Charlotte thinks that. I don't believe I've heard her that animated about anything since her mother passed." "She's a remarkable child," Charlotte said. "Brave in a way most grown men on this ranch could stand to learn from. She gets that from her mother." Cole said something soft and sad, moving across his face. "Eleanor was like that. Never let fear decide anything for her right up until the end." He was quiet a moment. "She died bringing Ruth into the world. 4 years back now. I've spent most of that time since telling myself I couldn't afford to feel anything too deep again, on account of how much it cost the last time I let myself." Charlotte's chest ached with recognition so sharp it startled her. "I understand that better than you might guess," she said quietly. After losing the ranch, I told myself the exact same thing. Built walls so high I nearly forgot what it felt like to want something for myself, instead of just surviving whatever came next. "And now?" Cole asked, voice careful, quiet, like he wasn't entirely sure he had the right to ask. Charlotte looked at him a long moment in the fading light, feeling something loosen in her chest that she'd kept clenched tight for 2 long years. "Now," she said slowly, "I find myself sitting on a porch I've known 5 days, talking with a man I've known 5 days, feeling considerably less walled off than I have in longer than I care to admit." Cole's breath caught audible in the quiet evening air. "Charlotte, I'm not asking for anything," she said quickly, suddenly uncertain, suddenly aware of how much she'd just revealed. "I don't want you thinking I expect—" "Charlotte," Cole said again, softer this time, and reached over to still her nervous hands with his own, warm and calloused and steady. "I've buried a wife. You've buried a husband. We both know better than most how fast good things can be taken away. I'm not looking to rush anything, and I'd never ask you to feel obligated on account of a week of hard circumstances thrown together." He held her gaze, something raw and honest in his expression that she hadn't seen from him before. "But I'd be lying if I said I haven't found myself thinking about you at hours that have got nothing to do with that horse or that ranch or any of the trouble Kane's brought down on us. I'd be lying if I said watching you with Ruth today didn't do something to my chest I wasn't prepared for." Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs, old fear and new hope warring inside her in equal measure. "Nathaniel," she said softly, testing his given name for the first time, feeling the shape of it settle unfamiliar and warm in her mouth. "I've spent 2 years convinced that wanting anything again was a mistake I couldn't afford to make twice." "And now?" he asked again, quieter still. "Now," she admitted. "I'm not so certain anymore." Neither of them moved to close the remaining distance between them, the hour, the exhaustion, the enormous uncertainty still hanging over tomorrow's inspection, all conspiring to hold them in careful charged stillness. But something had shifted between them regardless. Something neither could easily take back now that it had been spoken aloud. Dawn arrived gray and tense, every hand on the ranch moving with the particular quiet efficiency of people bracing for a day that would determine everything. Charlotte was in the corral before sunrise, working with Kane in the last precious hours before the inspector's arrival, coaxing him through simple exercises, accepting a hand near his neck, standing calm while she moved slowly around him, tolerating the light weight of a saddle blanket draped briefly across his back before she removed it again. He wasn't fully gentled. She knew that better than anyone, but he was calmer than he'd been in longer than the ranch hands could remember, and calm, she reminded herself, was the only miracle she'd ever promised to deliver. The Army inspector arrived shortly after 9, a lean, weathered officer named Captain Elias Marsh, accompanied by 2 enlisted men and an air of brisk professional skepticism that did nothing to ease the knot in Charlotte's stomach. "Mr. Cole," Marsh said, dismounting with military precision. "Word reached the fort that your prize stallion had a rather violent week. I confess I nearly postponed this visit." "Circumstances have improved considerably, Captain," Cole said, gesturing toward the corral where Kane stood watching the newcomers with wary but controlled attention. "This is Miss Charlotte Reed. She's been working with him directly." Marsh's eyes moved over Charlotte with the same assessing skepticism she'd grown accustomed to receiving from every man who doubted a woman could accomplish what she claimed. "A trainer," he said. "Unusual arrangement." "An effective one," Charlotte said evenly. "Would you care to see for yourself, Captain, rather than take either of our words for it?" Something flickered in Marsh's expression, surprise perhaps at her directness, but he nodded, gesturing for her to proceed. Charlotte climbed the fence and approached Kane with the same slow, careful patience she'd used every day since her arrival. The stallion watched the newcomers with obvious tension ears flicking toward the unfamiliar uniforms. But when Charlotte reached his side and laid a steady hand against his neck, he remained still, breathing hard but controlled. "Remarkable," Marsh murmured, watching from the fence. 5 days ago, by all accounts, this animal killed a man. 5 days ago. Charlotte said nobody had bothered asking why he was so afraid in the first place. Marsh's eyes sharpened with professional interest. "And you have an answer?" Before Charlotte could respond, hoofbeats sounded at the ranch gate fast and hard, and every head turned to find Silas Kane riding in at a pace that abandoned all pretense of his usual composed arrival, 2 riders trailing hard behind him. "Captain Marsh," Kane called out, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "I'm relieved I caught you before you concluded your business here. There are matters concerning that animal you should be made aware of before any contract proceeds." Cole's hand moved instinctively toward his hip, though he wore no weapon. "You've got no business here, Kane. I've got every business here," Kane said, his voice carrying the same practiced charm Charlotte had first witnessed on the porch, though strain showed now at its edges. "Captain, that horse has a history of violence extending back years long before it ever came to this ranch. I'd hate to see the Army enter into a contract for breeding stock that poses genuine danger to soldiers and civilians alike." "Interesting," Marsh said slowly, "that you'd know such detailed history about a horse you claim no connection to." Kane's smile faltered just slightly. "I make it my business to know the reputation of horseflesh throughout the territory, Captain. Nothing more." "Is that so?" Charlotte said, stepping forward from the corral, Kane following her movement with wary attention, but no longer bolting at the sound of raised voices. "Then perhaps you'd care to explain, Mr. Kane, why Sheriff Whitfield currently holds a bill of sale bearing your own signature transferring ownership of this exact horse some years back." The color drained visibly from Kane's face. "I don't know what nonsense you're—" "Or perhaps?" Charlotte continued, relentless now, watching every crack forming in his composure. "You'd care to explain the note found alongside it instructing someone to get rid of the black one before an Army inspector could examine him too closely. Whatever it takes, I believe the phrase was." "This is absurd," Kane said, though his voice had lost its smooth confidence entirely, now edges fraying visibly. Fabricated slander from a woman with no standing and a rancher desperate to save his failing property. Sheriff Whitfield doesn't seem to think it's fabricated, Cole said. Matter of fact, he's got a deputy posted at my gate right now, and I expect he'll be along shortly to discuss the matter directly with you, Silas, seeing as how one of your hired men already confessed to burning my barn and cutting that horse loose on your direct orders. Kane's composure shattered entirely. You have no proof of any wrongdoing on my part, he snarled, all pretense gone now, raw fury replacing the careful charm he'd worn like armor since his first arrival. That horse is dangerous, unpredictable, a liability to anyone foolish enough to trust him. Captain Marsh, Charlotte said, cutting through Kane's rising panic. Would you care to examine the scar on this horse's hip? I believe you'll find it consistent with a deliberate branding, not an accident inflicted by someone attempting to punish an animal for surviving something considerably worse. Marsh moved toward the fence, studying the jagged white mark on Kane's flank, with the careful clinical attention of a man who'd seen enough violence to recognize its particular signatures. That's not accidental scarring, Marsh said slowly. That's punishment deliberately applied. He turned to look at Kane, expression hardening into something formal and cold. Mr. Kane, I believe this matter now falls well outside the scope of my original visit. I'll be filing a report with both the Territorial Marshal's Office and Fort Carrington's command regarding these allegations, and I'd strongly advise you remain in the county until Sheriff Whitfield has concluded his own investigation. This is preposterous. Kane spat through the fury, and his voice had begun curdling into something closer to desperation. I built my reputation in this territory over 15 years. I will not have it destroyed by the ravings of a horse trainer and a rancher too stubborn to accept a fair business offer. Funny, Cole said, voice low and dangerous. How a fair business offer always seemed to arrive right alongside burned barns and cut fences, Silas. Almost like you knew this land would never sell honest, so you set about making it impossible to keep instead. Kane's eyes cut toward Charlotte, toward Kane standing calm and watchful beside her, and something in his expression twisted into naked hatred. That horse should have died years ago, he snarled. Same as it nearly did before I got rid of it. Some animals are born broken beyond fixing, and no amount of foolish patience from some grieving widow is going to change what he really is underneath. The words landed like a physical blow, and Charlotte felt old grief and fresh fury rise together in her chest, sharp and clarifying. But before she could respond, Kane's head snapped up, ears pinning flat, and he let out a scream of pure furious recognition that sent Kane's horse rearing in alarm behind him. "Get him under control!" Kane shouted, scrambling backward. "He is under control," Charlotte said, standing firm beside the enraged stallion, one hand still resting steady against his neck despite his obvious agitation. "He's simply telling you exactly what he thinks of you, and honestly, Mr. Kane, I can't say I blame him one bit." Sheriff Whitfield arrived 20 minutes later to find Kane detained by Deputy Beckett near the gate. Captain Marsh taking careful notes on everything that had transpired, and Kane finally settling back into wary calm under Charlotte's steady hand. "Silas Kane," Whitfield said, dismounting with grim satisfaction. "I've spent the morning corroborating young Purnell's confession with witnesses back in your old territory up in Nebraska. Seems there's a rancher up there who remembers a man dying during a breaking session on your property some years back, and remembers you paying considerable money to make sure the story never spread beyond your own fence line." Kane's face had gone the color of old ash. "You have no jurisdiction to. I've got a signed bill of sale, a written confession, a federal officer's testimony regarding deliberate injury to livestock, and now corroborating witnesses to a man's death. You tried mighty hard to bury," Whitfield said. "I'd say that's jurisdiction enough to place you under arrest, Silas, pending a full investigation by the Territorial Marshal." The two riders who'd accompanied Kane made no move to intervene, watching their employer's downfall with the careful stillness of men, calculating how quickly they could distance themselves from association with his crimes. "This isn't finished," Kane snarled as Beckett moved to bind his wrists. "I've got friends in this territory who won't take kindly to—" "Your friends can take it up with the judge," Whitfield said flatly. Same as you're about to. As they led him away, Charlotte watched the man who'd terrorized this ranch, who'd tortured an innocent animal to protect his own reputation, who'd nearly cost them everything they'd fought so hard to protect, finally reduced to nothing but empty threats and desperate bluster. Cain watched him go too, and something in the stallion's posture shifted as the sound of Cain's voice faded into the distance. Not quite relaxation. Not yet, but something adjacent to it. The particular loosening of a creature who'd finally watched his greatest fear be led away in chains. Captain Marsh approached Charlotte once the yard had settled, his earlier skepticism replaced now with something considerably more respectful. "Miss Reed," he said, "in 15 years inspecting livestock for Army contracts, I've rarely witnessed anything quite like what you've accomplished here this week. That horse should be by every reasonable measure unsalvageable." "He's not unsalvageable, Captain," Charlotte said. "He was simply hurt by someone who preferred punishment to patience. Every creature deserves the chance to be understood before they're condemned." Marsh studied her a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll be recommending a delayed timeline for the stud contract," he said, "given the circumstances of this week. 60 days rather than immediate placement to allow his training to properly settle. But I have no doubt, having witnessed this morning's events, that this horse will more than fulfill his contract when the time comes." Relief flooded through Charlotte, so profound it nearly buckled her knees. "Thank you, Captain." "Thank you," Marsh said, "for reminding an old soldier that not every problem requires force to solve." He glanced toward Cole, who stood watching the exchange with an expression of exhausted, disbelieving relief. "You've got a remarkable woman working your ranch, Mr. Cole. I'd advise you find a way to keep her." Cole's eyes met Charlotte's across the yard, something warm and certain passing between them that needed no further words to explain. "I intend to try, Captain," he said quietly. "I intend to try." The days that followed Cain's arrest passed in a strange, unfamiliar rhythm for Charlotte. Quiet in a way the ranch hadn't been quiet since she'd first climbed off the noon stage into a town burying its dead. No more lanterns bobbing along the fence line through the night. No more rifles resting ready at the corral rail. Just the steady, unremarkable work of gentling a wounded animal one patient hour at a time, and the equally unfamiliar sensation of a household beginning tentatively to breathe easy again. Otis found her at the corral 3 mornings after the inspector's visit, coffee in hand, watching Cain graze without a single flick of wariness in his ears. "Sheriff sent word," he said, holding out a folded paper. "Trial's set for next month. Territorial Marshal's taking the case personal, seeing as how there's a dead man up in Nebraska whose family never got a straight answer about how he died." He hesitated, turning his hat over in his hands, the way he did when something sat uneasy in him. "Wanted to say something to you, Miss Reed, and I don't say things like this easy, so I'd appreciate you letting me get through it without interrupting." "I'm listening, Mr. Pruitt." "I was wrong about you," Otis said plainly. "Wrong from the first minute you climbed off that stage, asking after a horse that had just killed my friend. I thought you were fool enough to get yourself killed, or worse, fool enough to get somebody else killed on account of your foolishness. Been 30 years I've worked horses on this land, and I never once seen anybody do what you did with that animal." He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the length of his own confession. "Tom would have liked you, I think. He always did have more patience than the rest of us. Might be why that horse hurt him at all. Pure bad luck, wrong moment, nothing more. I don't reckon he'd hold it against you for finishing what he couldn't." Charlotte felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. "That means more to me than you know, Otis." "Don't go soft on me now," he said gruffly, though something in his weathered face had softened considerably, despite his words. "Just wanted it said plain is all. You're welcome on this ranch far as I'm concerned, and I don't extend that welcome easy." He walked off before she could respond further, and Charlotte turned back to Cain, who stood watching the exchange with the particular attentiveness he'd developed over the past week, as though he understood in whatever way a horse could understand such things, that the tide of this place had finally turned in his favor. "You hear that?" she murmured to him. "Even Otis Pruitt's coming around. There's hope for anybody yet, it seems." The romance between Charlotte and Nathaniel unfolded the way most true things did on that ranch. Slowly, honestly, without the rush and drama that had marked every dangerous thing that came before it. It was Ruth, in the end, who first said aloud what both adults had been carefully circling for days. "Are you going to marry Charlotte, Papa?" The question landed at the supper table on a Tuesday evening, delivered with all the blunt, unself-conscious honesty of a 7-year-old who'd decided the matter was settled and simply needed the grown-ups to catch up. Cole choked on his coffee. Charlotte's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "Ruth," Cole said, setting his cup down with exaggerated care, "that is not a question you ask at the supper table. Why not? Martha says you two been sitting on the porch every night this week, talking till the lamp burns low, and she says that's what courting looks like." "Martha," Cole said, raising his voice toward the kitchen, "has entirely too much opinion about matters that don't concern her. I heard that Nathaniel Cole," Martha called back unbothered, "and I'll say it again to your face if you'd like. That woman turned your daughter's whole world right side up and saved this ranch besides. Only a fool wouldn't be courting her proper by now." Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks, torn between mortification and something warmer that she couldn't quite name. Across the table, Cole met her eyes, and instead of the flustered retreat she half expected, she saw something steady and certain settle over his face instead. "She's not wrong," he said quietly to Charlotte, rather than to the room at large. "Martha, I mean, about the courting part." "Nathaniel, I've been dancing around saying it plain for a week now," he continued undeterred, "on account of not wanting to rush anything after everything you've survived, everything we've both survived. But I reckon my daughter's got more courage than her father does most days, so I'll follow her lead." He reached across the table, not quite touching Charlotte's hand, but close enough that the offer was unmistakable. "I'd like to court you proper, Charlotte Reed. Not on account of gratitude for what you did with that horse, though. Lord knows I'm grateful. On account of the fact that I haven't felt this much like myself again in 4 long years, and I believe you're the reason why." The table went silent. Ruth watched with wide, delighted eyes. Even Martha had gone still in the kitchen doorway, dish towel forgotten in her hands. Charlotte looked at the offered hand at the man behind it who'd buried a wife and rebuilt himself into something guarded and quiet at the daughter. Watching with such open hope, it made her chest ache and felt something in her own careful walls finally fully give way. "I'd like that too," she said softly, taking his hand at last. "Very much." Ruth let out a whoop of triumph that startled Cain clear across the yard, and even that, in the strange healing logic of that summer, felt like exactly the right kind of noise for a house that had spent too long being quiet. Not every day carried such easy joy, however. 2 weeks into the courtship, a letter arrived from Nebraska that threatened briefly to unravel everything they'd built. Charlotte found Cole alone in his study, the letter spread open before him, his face drawn tight with an old familiar grief. "What is it?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. "Territorial Marshal forwarded this," Cole said, voice rough, "from the family of the man Cain killed up in Nebraska, his widow." He pushed the letter toward her. "She wants to come testify at the trial. Wants to see justice done proper after 5 years of not knowing the full truth of how her husband died." Charlotte scanned the letter, feeling the weight of it settle heavy in her chest. Another widow, another grief, carried too long in silence, another life. Silas Cain's cruelty had shattered beyond simple repair. "That's a brave thing," she said quietly, traveling this far to face down the man responsible. "It is," Cole agreed. "But it's also a reminder, Charlotte, of exactly how much damage one man's greed can do. Tom's dead. This woman's husband is dead. Cain nearly died a dozen times over. And Cain sat comfortable in his fine house all these years, never once losing a night's sleep over any of it." He rubbed a hand across his tired face. "Makes a man wonder if justice ever really balances the scale, or if it just marks where the damage stopped spreading." Charlotte reached across and took his hand, steadying him the way he'd steadied her more than once these past weeks. "It doesn't balance the scale," she said honestly. "Nothing ever fully does not grief this deep. But it stops him from doing it again, Nathaniel. It gives that widow answers she's waited 5 years to get. It lets Cain live the rest of his life without fear that man might come back to finish what he started. She squeezed his hand. That's not everything. But it's not nothing either. Cole looked at her a long moment, something in his expression easing slightly under the weight of her certainty. You always know exactly the right thing to say. I've had considerable practice comforting myself through grief I couldn't fix, Charlotte said. Might as well put the skill to good use for somebody else. Why? The trial itself, when it finally came, proved almost anticlimactic in its swiftness. Faced with the bill of sale, the written note. Purnell's sworn confession. Captain Marsh's official testimony regarding the deliberate nature of Cain's scarring, and the devastating account delivered by the widow from Nebraska, describing 5 years of unanswered grief. Cain's carefully constructed reputation collapsed entirely within a single afternoon in the territorial courthouse. Charlotte and Cole attended together, sitting near the back of the crowded room, watching as the man who'd terrorized their ranch and tortured an innocent animal finally answered for years of buried cruelty. Cain's composure, so carefully maintained through every prior encounter, cracked entirely under the weight of testimony he could no longer talk his way around. I never meant for Riley to die, he said at one point, voice small and desperate in a way that bore no resemblance to the smooth, confident man who'd once sat uninvited on Nathaniel Cole's porch. It was an accident. The horse panicked during the breaking through him and instead of grieving him proper, instead of answering honest for what happened, the prosecutor said, voice cutting and precise, you took a hot iron to that animal's flank as punishment, then sold him off cheap to make certain nobody ever traced the truth back to your door. You spent 5 years building a fortune on land deals and army contracts, all while a widow in Nebraska wondered why her husband's death was never properly explained. Cain had no answer for that. The judge, when the verdict finally came, showed no mercy for a man who'd compounded one tragedy with years of deliberate, calculated cruelty. 15 years in the territorial prison, along with the forfeiture of enough of his holdings to provide restitution to both the Nebraska widow and, to Charlotte's quiet surprise, a smaller settlement toward the care of the very horse he'd once tried to destroy. Outside the courthouse, the Nebraska widow, a weathered woman named Constance Riley, no relation to Tom, simply a cruel coincidence of shared surnames that had struck Charlotte hard when she'd first heard it, found Charlotte in the dispersing crowd. You're the one who gentled him, Constance said. The horse. Cain, they're calling him now. I am, Charlotte said. My husband's name was Samuel, Constance said, voice thick with old grief carried a long distance. He wasn't a horseman by trade. Cain hired him cheap, promised him a bonus if he could break that stallion quick for an upcoming sale. Samuel needed the money bad enough he didn't ask too many questions about why the horse was so troubled to begin with. She looked toward the courthouse, toward the building where justice, however incomplete, had finally been delivered. I've spent 5 years believing that horse was simply evil, cursed like the stories always said. Hearing today that he was hurting, not evil, that Cain made him that way, I don't rightly know how to feel about it. Grief doesn't organize itself neat, Mrs. Riley, Charlotte said gently. You're allowed to feel more than one thing at once. Sorrow for Samuel, understanding for Cain. They don't have to cancel each other out. Constance studied her a long moment, something easing slightly in her weathered face. I'd like to see him someday, she said. The horse. Not today. Maybe not for a good while yet. But someday I think I'd like to see for myself what became of him. You'd be welcome, Charlotte said. Anytime you're ready. Kug. Summer stretched on toward autumn with a gentleness the ranch hadn't known in longer than anyone could easily remember. Cain's training progressed steadily under Charlotte's patient hand, not the dramatic sudden breakthroughs of that first turbulent week, but the slow, cumulative work of trust properly built, day upon careful day. He learned to accept a saddle blanket without flinching, learned to stand calm while Charlotte worked a soft rope loosely around his neck, never tightening, never forcing, simply letting him grow accustomed to the sensation, until it held no more threat than the wind moving through his mane. He learned eventually to lower his great head willingly for Ruth's small hand to nose gently at the pocket of her dress, where she'd taken to hiding sugar cubes smuggled from Martha's kitchen. "You spoil him," Charlotte said one afternoon, watching Ruth feed him yet another cube with the solemn ceremony of a girl performing sacred ritual. "He deserves spoiling," Ruth said matter-of-factly. "Papa says nobody spoiled him near enough before, and that's half of why he got so scared and mean in the first place." "Your papa's not wrong about that." Ruth glanced up at her, considering something with the particular seriousness she reserved for important questions. "Are you going to be my mama now, since you and Papa are courting?" Charlotte's chest tightened old caution and new hope, warring together in a way that had become almost familiar these past weeks. "I don't know that anybody could ever replace your mama, sweetheart," she said carefully. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," Ruth agreed. "Martha says so all the time, but I don't hardly remember her on account of I was just a baby." She looked back toward Kane, chewing her lip thoughtfully. "I think there's room for more than one, though. Like how Kane's got room to trust you and me both, even though he doesn't trust nobody else yet. Maybe hearts work the same way as horses." Charlotte felt tears threaten unexpectedly, and she blinked them back, crouching down to meet the girl's eyes properly. "I think that might be the wisest thing anybody's said to me in longer than I can remember, Ruth Cole." "So is that a yes?" "That's a yes," Charlotte said softly. "If your papa and I decide that's the path we're walking, I'd be honored to be whatever you'll have me as, sweetheart. Mama friend, whatever fits best in that generous heart of yours." Ruth beamed and threw her arms around Charlotte's neck with the sudden, uncomplicated affection only children seemed capable of offering so freely, and behind them unnoticed. Until that exact moment, Nathaniel Cole stood watching from the barn doorway with an expression so full of quiet, overwhelmed love that Charlotte's own heart nearly broke wide open at the sight of it. The proposal, when it finally came, arrived without ceremony or elaborate planning. Simply Nathaniel, one warm September evening, finding Charlotte at the corral fence, watching Kane graze in the settling dusk, and speaking the truth that had been building steadily between them for weeks. "I've been thinking," he said, joining her at the rail, "about something my grandfather used to say. About how a ranch isn't really land or cattle or fences. It's the people who choose to stay season after season, even when staying's hard." He was quiet a moment, watching Kane's dark shape move calm and unhurried through the fading light. "I spent 4 years after Eleanor died, believing I'd used up whatever capacity I had for that kind of choosing. Believed the staying part of me had died right along with her." "Nathaniel, let me finish," he said gently, and Charlotte fell silent, watching him gather whatever courage he needed for what came next. "Then you climbed off a stage into the worst week this ranch has seen in a decade, and instead of running from the trouble, you climbed straight into the middle of it. You didn't just gentle that horse, Charlotte. You gentled something in me I'd given up hoping could ever be gentled again." He turned to face her, fully taking both her hands in his. "I don't have anything fancy to offer you. Just a ranch that survived considerable trouble, a daughter who already loves you fierce, and a heart I thought I'd never trust to anybody again, but find myself trusting entirely to you." He drew a steadying breath. "Charlotte Reed, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Charlotte felt the question settle over her like sunlight after a long, hard winter. Warm, certain, entirely unexpected in how completely it filled the empty places 2 years of grief had carved out inside her. "Yes," she said, and the word came easier than she'd imagined any such word could after everything. "Yes, Nathaniel, I will." Behind them, as though he understood the significance of the moment, in whatever way horses understand such things, Kane lifted his head from grazing and let out a low, contented sound that carried across the darkening yard like a blessing, freely given. The wedding, when it came 3 weeks later, drew nearly the entire county to witness a ceremony that felt to everyone present like the proper closing of a story that had begun in tragedy and found its way against every reasonable expectation toward joy. Ruth served as flower girl with fierce, serious dedication to her duty, scattering petals along the path with the same solemnity she brought to feeding Kane his sugar cubes. Otis stood as one of the witnesses, gruffly proud, in a way he'd never admit outright. Martha wept openly through the entire ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she'd embroidered specially for the occasion. And Cain, though no one had planned it, stood calm and watchful at the corral fence throughout the whole affair, drawn perhaps by the gathered crowd, or perhaps by something more instinctive. Some understanding, however dim, that the two people who'd fought so hard to save him were now bound together in the same patient, hard-won trust he himself had learned to give. Constance Riley made the journey down from Nebraska for the occasion, standing quietly toward the back of the gathered crowd, and found Charlotte afterward amid the celebration. "I came to see him," she said, nodding toward Cain. "Like I said I would. Wanted to see for myself what patience built out of the wreckage Cain left behind." Charlotte led her to the fence, and together they watched the stallion graze in peaceful, unhurried circles, utterly transformed from the terrified, violent creature who'd killed a man barely 3 months prior. "He's beautiful," Constance said softly. "I never let myself think that all these years. Just thought of him as the thing that took Samuel from me." "He didn't take anything from you, Mrs. Riley," Charlotte said gently. "Cain's cruelty did that. Cain was just as much a victim as Samuel was in his own way. Different kind of casualty, same source of harm." Constance was quiet a long moment, watching the horse graze. "I think," she said finally, "I might finally be ready to let go of some of that anger I've carried. Watching him like this. Watching what love and patience managed to build from something so broken." She looked at Charlotte with something like gratitude softening her weathered face. "Thank you for that, if nothing else. For giving me somewhere to set that grief down finally, instead of carrying it forever." Autumn deepened into the ranch's first truly peaceful season in longer than anyone could easily recall. The stud contract with Fort Carrington proceeded exactly as Captain Marsh had promised. Cain's calm, steady temperament, under saddle, proving so remarkable that word of his transformation spread through the territory as fast as the earlier rumors of his violence once had. It was on a crisp October morning, nearly 4 months after Charlotte had first climbed off that noon stage into a town burying its dead, that she finally set a saddle fully upon Cain's back for the first time. The whole ranch gathered to watch Nathaniel and Ruth at the fence, Otis and Martha, and every hand who'd once doubted her capacity to accomplish exactly what she'd promised. Cain stood still beneath the weight, ears flicking, but calm, no trace remaining of the terrified, violent animal who'd once torn apart every rail that dared confine him. "You ready for this?" Nathaniel called from the fence, unable to keep the pride from his voice. "He's ready," Charlotte said, settling her hand against the stallion's neck one final time before swinging up into the saddle with the same slow, deliberate patience that had governed every moment of their journey together. "We both are." Cain shifted beneath her weight, testing it, weighing it against every instinct that had once told him human contact meant only pain. Then slowly, he took a single step forward, then another. He wasn't defeated. Charlotte understood that with a clarity that settled deep and certain in her chest as she guided him around the corral's perimeter, feeling the powerful, controlled strength of him beneath her, entirely different from the frantic, terrified violence of that first devastating morning. He had simply finally chosen to trust. The gathered ranch hands broke into spontaneous applause as she brought him to a gentle stop before the fence, and Ruth's delighted shriek of joy pierced clean through the autumn air. "You did it!" the girl called out. "You actually did it, Charlotte." "We did it," Charlotte corrected, echoing the words she'd spoken to Nathaniel that first exhausting dawn after Cain's near-fatal flight toward the ravine. "All of us. Him most of all." Nathaniel climbed the fence and crossed the corral, standing beside them both, one hand resting proud and gentle against Cain's neck. "4 months ago," he said quietly, "I stood right here and watched this animal kill a good man. I never once imagined I'd stand here again, watching him carry my wife across this very ground, calm as any horse I've ever known. Grief doesn't always stay grief forever," Charlotte said softly, looking down at him from the saddle, feeling the full weight of everything they'd survived together settle into something that finally fully resembled peace. Sometimes, if you're patient enough, if you're willing to sit in the hard, uncertain middle of it long enough, it turns into something else entirely. Winter came gentle to the Blackwood Ranch that year, softer than any season Nathaniel Cole could remember, since long before Eleanor's passing. The barn rebuilt stronger than before, with lumber from a timber contract Charlotte had helped negotiate, stood solid against the first snows. Cain, fully gentled, now spent his days working the fields alongside the ranch's other horses, occasionally allowing Ruth to ride him at a slow, careful walk under Charlotte's watchful supervision. His once violent temperament transformed entirely into something gentle and sure. Sheriff Whitfield rode out one December afternoon with news that closed the final chapter of Cain's cruelty confirmation that his remaining assets, seized as part of his sentencing, had been distributed properly among his victims, with a considerable sum reaching Constance Riley in Nebraska, and a smaller portion going toward a fund Charlotte had established for gentling other troubled horses throughout the territory, animals whose owners might otherwise have reached for a bullet rather than patience. "Seems fitting," Whitfield said, accepting a cup of coffee from Martha's kitchen. "Man spent his whole life taking from folks who couldn't fight back proper. Least his money can do some good now going towards saving creatures instead of destroying them." "It is fitting," Charlotte agreed, watching through the window as Nathaniel worked alongside Otis in the yard, breath fogging in the cold air. Cain's dark shape visible near the barn, where Ruth was busy as always sneaking him treats. She thought nobody noticed. That evening, after Whitfield had ridden back toward town and Ruth had finally been coaxed to bed, despite her protests, Charlotte and Nathaniel sat together on the porch, wrapped against the cold, watching snow settle soft and quiet over land that had nearly been lost to greed and cruelty just months before. "Feels strange sometimes," Nathaniel admitted, "how quiet everything's become. After everything that happened this summer, part of me keeps waiting for the next disaster." "That's grief talking," Charlotte said gently. "The part of us that survived something terrible learns to expect terrible things constantly, even after the danger's passed. Takes time to unlearn that particular kind of watchfulness." "You'd know," Nathaniel said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer against the cold. "Better than most anybody I've ever known." "I would," Charlotte agreed, settling into the warmth of him, feeling something in her chest that had stayed clenched tight since Daniel's death finally fully release. "But I've learned something else too this year. Something I don't think I truly believed, until I watched that horse choose to trust me, until I watched you and Ruth choose to let me into your lives, despite every reason caution might have given you to hold back." "What's that?" "That the watchfulness doesn't have to win," Charlotte said softly. "That a person can carry grief and still choose hope. Can remember every hard lesson loss ever taught them, and still decide deliberately to open their heart again anyway." She looked up at him, snow catching soft in her hair, feeling entirely finally at peace, in a way she'd once believed lost to her forever. "That's not foolishness, Nathaniel. That's the bravest thing a wounded heart can do." Nathaniel was quiet a long moment, watching the snow fall silent over the ranch that had nearly destroyed them both, now standing solid and safe and full of quiet, hard-won joy. "I love you, Charlotte Cole," he said finally, using her married name with a warmth that still months later made her chest ache with happiness. "More than I believed myself capable of loving anything again." "I love you too," Charlotte said. "All of you. This ranch, this daughter, this whole beautiful, complicated life we've built out of what should have been nothing but tragedy." Inside the house, faint but unmistakable, came the small, muffled sound of Ruth already dreaming. And beyond the porch, calm and steady in the winter dark, came the quiet, contented breathing of a stallion who'd once been called cursed beyond saving, now standing peaceful under a sky full of falling snow. The people of Larkspur Hollow still told the story that winter, and every winter after, of the wild black stallion who'd killed a man and the widow who'd walked straight into his corral anyway, unafraid of the danger everyone else had already surrendered to. They told it in the saloon, in the church pews, in the schoolhouse, where Ruth Cole would grow up proud to share her family's remarkable history. They told it as a warning against cruelty, as a lesson in patience, as proof that even the most broken creatures, horse or human alike, could find their way back to trust given enough time and enough love and enough people willing to stay close through the hardest parts of healing. But most of all, they told it as a promise. That grief, however devastating, however permanent it seemed in its darkest hours, was never truly the end of any story. That somewhere beyond the wreckage of loss, if a person was patient enough, brave enough, willing enough to keep believing in something better, hope was always waiting to be found again. Charlotte Cole had proven that truth to an entire ranch, to a wounded animal nobody else believed could be saved, and most of all to herself. And in the end, that was a truth strong enough to outlast every hardship that had ever tried to break it, a truth that would carry the Blackwood Ranch and everyone who called it home, steady and unshaken into every season still to come.